Oh, to better times. Before the 13th round debacle of Tata Steel 2021 covered in my previous video, there was round 7 when Alireza Firouzja was taking on Jan Krzysztof Duda. And there were only, I think, 6 rating points separated them. This was a game necessary to keep him in the tournament, keep him tied for first place. It's a really interesting game. Let's get right into it. Firouzja has white, Duda has black. Firouzja begins with d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, bishop to f4. The London system. This is a regular part of Firouzja's repertoire. He plays a lot of different things, of course. e6, e3, bishop to d6, immediately challenging the bishop at f4 and particularly putting some pressure on the e5 square. Knight b to d2, Firouzja doesn't mind. Bishop takes because pawn takes. It controls the e5 square. He'd be happy. Castles, knight to e5. He jumps right in. The knight hops into the e5 square, and also this queen can control h5, which stops black's knight from coming over here to irritate that bishop at f4. c5, attacking the pawn chain. c3, supporting it. Queen to c7, a flexible square for the queen, putting pressure on the knight on e5. Also, if the c file were to open up, the queen would be well positioned. Bishop to d3. An aggressive posting of the bishop helps control the e4 square, and also maybe can put some pressure on h7 near black's king later. b6. The idea here is black can play the bishop to b7 or even to a6 to challenge that bishop on d3. And Firouzja plays a very Firouzja-like move. Here, instead of castling, he plays h4. We all know how Alireza Firouzja will often avoid castling or put his king in jeopardy in order to get an edge in another sector of the board. Well, here he does not castle, but instead he gains space on the king side and opens up a potential rook lift for his rook by playing h4. This position, I think, has been reached 7 times in my database, and there's a very nice plus score for white in this position. And all of the players that have reached this position, except for maybe one, are 2,500 plus. So this is a position that's played by very strong players. Bishop to a6 is Duda's choice. He immediately challenges the bishop at d3, really forcing it off because Alireza cannot let him have that bishop a6 f1 diagonal to himself. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and the knight, at the very least, the knight is a little bit misplaced at a6, so he'll have to take some time to reroute it. h5, continuing to gain space near the king. Knight to d7, challenging the knight on e5 further. Computers prefer the move h6. The only problem with knight to d7 is now he can play the knight at d2 to f3, which he does. He doesn't have to worry about a knight hopping into e4 now that the knight at f6 has moved back to d7. f6, and by the way, knight df3 is the game's novelty. Black plays f6. It kicks the knight out, but it creates some weaknesses around the king. The knight goes back to d3. He doesn't want to exchange pieces. cd4. Now knight d4. This is a really interesting position. And basically, white has a lot of threats, right? He's threatening to take the pawn at e6, which would fork the rook and the queen. He's also threatening to come into b5, which would fork the queen and the bishop and win a minor piece that way. So why would Duda voluntarily go into this position? Well, this is a strategic and intentional sacrifice of an exchange. He's going to give up a rook, but he's going to get an incredibly strong knight in return. So let's look at what happens. Duda plays e5, knight to e6, queen to c4, knight takes rook, bishop takes rook. The bishop, of course, has to move because it's going to be captured. And now knight d to c5. Everything's sort of coming in on this d3 square. And after knight takes knight, knight takes knight, Duda is threatening knight to d3 check. And that would be an extremely strong minor piece. Or should I say, it's going to be an extremely strong minor piece. So Firouzja plays rook to h4. We see the rook emerge after the promised h4, h5 liberated it. It attacks the queen laterally. Black plays e4, blocking the attack on the queen and also creating a pawn supported support point at d3, queen to e2. Of course, Firouzja would love to trade queens here, being up the exchange. But instead, knight to d3 check is played, a much better move. Then king to f1. Now, it may look like Duda is threatening to just take on b2 because the queen at e2 was pinned by the queen at c4. That would be giving up material. But if he did that here, knight takes b2, then queen c4, rook to d1. And it's really not possible to defend the pawn at d5. Because if rook to d8 were played, boom, rook takes e4. And it's a pin along that d file. So he plays f5, defending e4 again. And now knight takes b2 is threatened because that final move, rook takes e4, doesn't work because the f-pawn would capture. King to g1, removing the pin from the queen. And that way, the b2 pawn is protected. Rook to c8. Now, the rook has done what it can do on h4. The rook comes back to h1. He's going to play the king to g1 to h2 and then move that rook back into action. King to f7, activating the king. With queen still on the board, that can be dangerous, but he feels he has enough, Duda feels he has enough of a grip on the position that he can do that. King to h2, bishop to e7, and now a3. That frees up the rook at a1. He wants to move that rook at a1, but he doesn't want to hang the a2 pawn, so he plays a3 to protect it. b5, a typical sort of minority attack move. You come in, moves like this, get a strong counterplay. Rook a to d1, king to e6. Now this knight at d3 is so strong. A knight firmly entrenched on the 6th rank is at least as powerful as a rook, at least. So Firouzja has to do something about it. It has become intolerable. So he gives back the exchange to get rid of this knight. Rook takes d3, queen d3, queen d3, e d3, rook to d1. So it looks really good for Firouzja. He can just take the d3 pawn and be in great shape. Be up a pawn with a better position, a healthier pawn structure. But now Duda, a super GM, an incredible player, comes up with a diabolical concept. He probably had seen this before he reached this position. But he plays bishop takes a3, a powerful blow. He gives up the bishop, but he gets 3 pawns in exchange and has dynamic equality. So after pawn takes bishop, rook takes c3, king to g1. The king has to get back into the action. Rook takes a3, and black now has 3 pawns for the bishop and sufficient counterplay. King to f1, b4, marching those pawns. King to e1, b3 coming in. King to d2. If he plays rook to d3, then boom, b2. And that would be a winning position for black because there's nothing he can do. Rook takes rook, he would just queen. If rook d1, rook a1, that would be it. So he can't do that. He plays king to d2, and now b2. It might have been, the computer suggests the move a5 is a little bit better to connect those pawns, but this setup from Duda looks really strong. He plays b2, and after rook b1, rook to b3, and you can see this formation he's got here, where the rook on b3 defends b2 and d3, and now the threat of that a-pawn marching up the board is really tough for Firouzja to deal with. He has to make some very exact moves to deal with these threats, and he begins with an exact move. He plays bishop to c7, and that stops the pawn from going to a5. Duda plays d4, giving a pawn up, but clearing the way for his king. He knows he can get the pawn back, very likely, but his king has to penetrate into the position if he wants any winning chances. e4, king d5, now f4. What this does is it creates a support point on e5 for the bishop. Normally, a move like that would limit the bishop's scope. You wouldn't want to play it, but in this case, it creates that strong point at b5, or e5 for the bishop. g6 and then h6. An important move. This pawn at h6 could become a big problem for black later on in the game. King takes d4, bishop e5 check, king e4, bishop to b2. Takes care of that pawn at b2, and that's got to be a relief for Firouzja. If he plays a move like, if Duda played king f4, bishop e5 check, would lose the exchange and the game. So he plays rook to b7, rook to e1 check, king f4, and you notice black still has 3 pawns for the piece. bishop to e5 check, king g4, king takes pawn. g5, he begins to advance his pawn majority on the king side. Pawns, you have pawns, you got to advance them. If the pawns are passed, you've got to advance those pawns. Bishop to d4, rook to d7, pinning the bishop. Rook to e6, putting the rook on an active square behind the passed pawns on the king side. King to g3, and rook to f6. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. So he plays the king back to g4, rook to a6, blockading the a pawn. And this is a big blunder. But it's the kind of move, you'd have to be very, very strong to know that it was a mistake. He plays f4. And the reason this is a mistake is that it allows Firouzja's king access to the e4 square, and that active nature of that king is going to be very, very important. This was a serious inaccuracy, as it turns out, because the king can become active. He does immediately go there. Rook to e7 check, bishop to e5, rook to b7, bishop to f6. And what this does is it ties the black king down to the defense of the g5 pawn. And white is now winning. He has to play precisely, but Firouzja is winning this position as of now. Rook to b4 check, bishop to d4 blocks it, king to h5, rook to d6. Now here, rook takes a7 would be a big mistake, because black would be able to take that pawn at h6, and now black should be able to hold this position without too much of a problem. Firouzja needs that h6 pawn, the threats that come with it, to win the game. Rook goes to d6, rook to a4. He played a5, then king to f5, a4, bishop to e5, a3, and now, boom, rook to d1, with a threat of rook to h1 mate is in the offing after king to h4, then rook to d3. The rook shifts to the mate threat on h3 instead, and if g4, bishop to f6, king h5, now the rook goes back to d1, rook b5, bishop e5, and black is busted. Go here, but then that's it. Boom, boom. And then rook to h1 is mate. Now, the f pawn isn't there anymore. The bishop controls g3, so that would have been mate. So a5 was not the best choice, and he plays rook to a4 instead, but Firouzja is still weaving the mating net. King to f5 is played, rook to a2 to aim at the g2 pawn, bishop to f6, and if Duda had taken that g2 pawn, then boom, rook to d1 with the same type of mating threats that we've already seen. Rook to h1 mate and 2 is threatened. And if Duda were to play rook h2, then just rook to g1 hits the g5 pawn, and that would lead to a decisive position. King to h6 is played. He gives up the h6 pawn eventually, but because he has unstoppable threats after this move, rook to d1, threatening rook to h1 mate, rook to a5, and bishop to e5. And rook to h1, the only way to stop mate is to actually take the bishop at e5, and that would be, Firouzja will be up a whole rook, and the game would be over. So Firouzja, these were happier times before the later controversy in the tournament, beating a very strong player, and you were beginning to see at this point in Firouzja's development the kind of chess play that made him the 2800 rated player he is today. I hope you've enjoyed this game, and join us again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.